Billionaires don't fear competitors in custom suits. They fear the guy with permanent grease under his fingernails and a soldering iron. Vivian laughed at his cramped, ozone-smelling repair shop. She thought she owned the world. She didn't realize he was already taking it apart, piece by piece. The air conditioning in the back of the town car had failed 40 minutes ago. Vivian sat rigid against the leather seat, feeling the damp heat of the afternoon press against her silk blouse. She hated sweating. Sweating was a biological inefficiency. It was a physical reminder that she was still subject to the same atmospheric conditions as the people walking on the cracked sidewalks outside her tinted windows. "Just pull over," she told her driver. "This is the address." Her shoe, a $400 pump, met the asphalt with a sharp click. The street smelled of hot tar and rotting oranges from a nearby dumpster. She looked up at the faded sign hanging by one rusted bolt over the door. Russo's Electronics and Hardware. Repairs. She didn't want to be here. As the CEO of Omnis, a multinational conglomerate holding a near monopoly on commercial culinary and refrigeration appliances, Vivian usually had teams of technicians to handle malfunctions. But this was different. The custom cooling manifold for her private wine cellar, a prototype built by her own engineers, had seized. The engineers were at a retreat in Geneva. The cellar held $3 million of vintage inventory that was currently warming to room temperature. A junior assistant, trembling, had suggested this shop. "He fixes the things we say can't be fixed," the assistant had whispered. Vivian pushed the glass door open. A bell jingled, a sound so cheerful and cheap it made her teeth grind. The shop was a graveyard, aisle upon aisle of gutted washing machines, stripped circuit boards, and bruised steel casings. The air was thick. It smelled intensely of burnt rosin flux, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of ozone. Dust motes drifted lazily in the shafts of yellow light cutting through the grimy front window. Behind a scarred wooden counter, a man was hunched over a microscope. He didn't look up. "Excuse me," Vivian said. Her voice was flat, conditioned by 1,000 boardrooms to cut through noise. The man kept his eye pressed to the lens. His hands stained with dark grease into the very whorls of his fingerprints, held a soldering iron. A thin plume of blue smoke curled into the air. "Give me a minute," he muttered, tracing a short. "I don't have a minute." Vivian stepped closer. The floorboards creaked under her weight. "I have a proprietary Omnis cooling manifold that requires an immediate bypass. I'll pay you $1,000 to drop whatever you're doing and fix it now." The soldering iron hissed as he set it into its coiled metal stand. He finally looked up. Dean was not impressed. He saw a woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that cost more than his rent, standing in his shop like she was afraid the air might infect her. He saw the tension in her jaw. He looked at the heavy, brushed aluminum box she had unceremoniously dropped on his counter. "Omnis," Dean said. The word tasted sour in his mouth. He wiped his hands on a rag that was already more oil than cotton. "You guys put a DRM lock on the compressor valves. If the board doesn't read the exact serial number from the manufacturer, it bricks the whole unit." "I am aware of how my company's products operate," Vivian said, her eyes narrowing. "Can you bypass it or not?" Dean pulled the box toward him. The metal was still warm. He grabbed a power drill and stripped the proprietary tamper-proof screws in seconds, tossing them onto the counter where they clattered against spare diodes. Vivian watched, a flare of genuine annoyance warming her chest. Those screws were patented. "You're voiding the warranty," she said, half mocking. "Lady, I'm voiding the whole philosophy." Dean popped the casing off. The internal wiring was unnecessarily complex, a labyrinth designed to confuse independent mechanics. He hated it. It wasn't engineering. It was extortion. He reached for a pair of wire snips. You build things to break on a schedule, then you lock the software so nobody but your people can fix it. It's a racket. "It's a business model," Vivian corrected, crossing her arms. She looked around the cramped, claustrophobic shop. "A highly successful one, unlike whatever this is. How do you live like this? Salvaging scrap, fixing other people's garbage. It's small time. You're a scavenger." Dean didn't flinch. He snipped a blue wire, stripped the end with his thumbnail, and soldered it directly to a resistor, completely bypassing the microchip Omnis used to gatekeep the hardware. He felt the familiar, grounding heat of the iron. He liked fixing things. He liked the honesty of a circuit. It either worked or it didn't. It couldn't lie to you. "I fix garbage," Dean said quietly, not looking up from the board. "Because people like you sell garbage. You just put a shiny logo on it." He slapped the casing back on and pushed it across the counter. 10 minutes had passed. "Plug it in. It'll run. It won't talk to your app anymore, but it'll keep your wine cold." Vivian reached into her designer bag, pulling out a sleek leather wallet. She extracted 10 $100 bills and set them on the scratched wood. "Keep it," Dean said. He turned his back to her, picking up the motherboard he had been working on before she walked in. "I don't want your money. I just want you out of my shop." Vivian stared at the back of his faded denim shirt. For a second, a strange, uncomfortable sensation twisted in her stomach. It wasn't guilt. It was the absolute realization that she had zero leverage over him. Her money meant nothing. Her status meant nothing. She picked up her cash, shoved it back into her bag, and grabbed the heavy manifold. "Enjoy the dust, Dean," she said, reading the name embroidered on his greasy shop jacket. She walked out, the cheap bell jingling behind her. As she sank back into the sweltering leather of her car, she wiped a smudge of black grease off her palm. She scrubbed at it with a wet wipe until her skin was red and raw, but the faint smell of ozone lingered on her fingers. All the way home. 6 months later, the boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Omnis Tower smelled of dry erase markers and chilled, filtered air. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city below, a sprawling grid of grey and brown that looked entirely inconsequential from this height. Vivian sat at the head of a long mahogany table. In front of her was a tablet displaying a single spreadsheet. The numbers were clean. The math was undeniable. "If we shutter the Hawthorne facility," Arthur, her chief financial officer, said, tapping his pen against his notepad, "we can shift production of the commercial motor lines to the new automated plant in Shenzhen. We reduce overhead by 42%. The tax write-off on the Hawthorne property alone balances out the severance packages." Hawthorne was a legacy plant. It was massive, outdated, and employed 800 people in a factory town on the outskirts of the state. It was a relic from before Vivian took over the company, back when Omnis actually cast its own steel and wound its own copper. Vivian stared at the screen. 800 jobs. She felt a dull, familiar ache behind her sternum, the ulcer acting up again. She reached for her glass of alkaline water and took a slow sip. She wasn't a monster. She didn't enjoy firing people, but she felt absolutely nothing for them either. They were variables in an equation. Her job, her only metric for personal value in an otherwise empty life, was to make the line on the graph go up. "Close it," Vivian said. Her voice was devoid of inflection. "Give them the standard 3-month severance. Gut the machinery and sell it for scrap. Leave the building." Arthur nodded, making a neat little check mark on his pad. Done. 30 miles away, the town of Hawthorne didn't feel the pen stroke, but they felt the hemorrhage 3 weeks later. Dean sat in a corner booth at the Rusty Nail, the local bar that smelled of stale beer, bleach, and decades of spilled secrets. The wood of the table was sticky. He peeled his forearms off it, wrapping his hands around a lukewarm glass of draft. The bar was packed, but it was dead quiet. Men and women in heavy canvas jackets sat staring at their drinks. Cole, a man who had worked as a floor foreman at the Omnis plant for 25 years, sat across from Dean. Cole looked like a man who had just been told he had a terminal illness. His shoulders, usually broad and imposing, slumped inward. "They're taking the presses tomorrow," Cole said, his voice raspy. "Selling the die-cast molds to some liquidator in Ohio. Building's going to sit there and rot." Dean took a slow drink. The beer tasted metallic. He relied on Hawthorne. Half the replacement parts he used to fix Omnis machines came from the workers sneaking him slightly defective cast-offs, or from buying the surplus they sold at cost. With Hawthorne gone, Omnis's closed-loop ecosystem would be absolute. Everything would be sealed, automated, and imported. Unfixable. "What are you going to do, Cole?" Dean asked. "I'm 52, Dean. I know how to calibrate a 5-ton hydraulic press. I don't know how to code an app. I'll probably lose the house by Christmas." Dean looked around the room. He saw anger, but mostly he saw a crushing, heavy defeat. These were people who built things with their hands. They understood physics, leverage, torque, and heat. Now they were being discarded because a spreadsheet said they were too expensive. An image flashed in Dean's mind. The pristine, air-conditioned suit. The $400 shoes stepping gingerly on his linoleum floor. You're a scavenger, fixing other people's garbage. Dean's stomach twisted. It wasn't a noble feeling. It wasn't the swelling of a hero's heart. It was pure, unadulterated spite. It was a dark, ugly coal catching fire in his gut. He hated her. He hated the sterile, untouchable world she lived in, where decisions made in glass towers ripped the copper wiring right out of the walls of a town like Hawthorne. "What if we bought it?" Dean said. The words slipped out before his brain could filter them. Cole blinked, looking up slowly. "Bought what?" "The plant." Cole let out a dry, hacking laugh. "Dean, you own a repair shop the size of a shoebox. You drive a truck with a rusted-out floorboard. The property alone is worth millions." "It's a toxic asset," Dean countered, leaning forward, the sticky table forgotten. His heart started to hammer against his ribs. The math was crazy. It was suicidal. Omnis is dumping it. The soil has to be remediated. The roof leaks. They want it off their books for the tax break. They'd sell it for pennies on the dollar just to dump the liability. And the machinery? The liquidators? I know the liquidators. I buy scrap from them. We leverage everything. My shop, your houses. Everyone who wants in puts up their equity. We take out a commercial loan. We keep the presses." Cole stared at him, the dullness in his eyes slightly retreating, replaced by a cautious, terrified spark. "To build what, Dean? We don't have patents." "We don't need their patents," Dean said, his voice dropping low. "We know how their machines fail. We know the exact stress points of every commercial refrigerator and washing machine Omnis makes. We build the exact opposite. We build machines with heavy-duty copper. No software locks, standardized bolts, stuff any idiot with a wrench can fix. We sell them to diners, laundromats, independent contractors. We sell them at cost until we bleed her out." Dean's hands were shaking. He pulled them off the table and hid them in his lap. He was terrified. He was risking his meager livelihood and the livelihoods of everyone in this room, on a grudge. But the smell of the stale beer suddenly faded, replaced by the phantom scent of hot oil and grinding steel. It took 3 months. It was a nightmare of paperwork, screaming matches with bank officers, and nights where Dean woke up in a cold sweat, his chest tight with a panic attack so severe he had to lay on the bathroom floor just to catch his breath. He vomited twice in the alley behind the bank on the day he signed the final loan papers. His hand had trembled so violently he could barely hold the cheap plastic pen. He had put a lien on his shop. 140 workers put second mortgages on their homes. But on a rainy Tuesday in November, the deed to the Hawthorne plant transferred from Omnis Holdings to a newly formed LLC, Russo Heavy Industries. The noise was deafening. It was a beautiful, chaotic, violent sound. The concrete floor of the Hawthorne plant vibrated under Dean's steel-toed boots as the massive 5-ton hydraulic press slammed down. Thud, hiss, clank. The rhythm was a heartbeat, returning to a corpse. The air inside the cavernous building was freezing. They couldn't afford to run the industrial heaters yet. But Dean was sweating. The smell of aerosolized machine oil, hot metal, and the faint, sweet scent of ozone filled his lungs. It smelled like survival. Cole walked over, wiping grease from his forehead with the back of a thickly gloved hand. He yelled over the din of the machinery. "First batch of compressor housings just passed quality control. Castings are thick, no micro-fractures." Dean nodded, a tight, exhausted smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in weeks. There were dark, bruised bags under his eyes. "What about the wiring harnesses?" "Sarah's team is hand soldering the junctions," Cole yelled back. "No circuit boards, no proprietary chips, just raw analog switches. If it breaks, a kid with a screwdriver and a YouTube video can swap the part in 5 minutes. Dean walked over to the assembly line. They weren't building sleek, brushed aluminum appliances with touchscreens and Wi-Fi capabilities. They were building ugly, heavy, matte black boxes. They looked like military hardware. They were over-engineered, heavy-duty commercial refrigeration motors and industrial laundry servos. They named their first motor the Ironclad 1. Dean picked up a completed unit. It weighed 40 pounds. The casing was thick. The bolts were standard hex heads. It was a love letter to mechanics and a middle finger to planned obsolescence. They couldn't afford marketing. They didn't have a sales team. What Dean did have was a Rolodex of every frustrated repairman, independent diner owner, and commercial contractor who had ever brought a bricked Omnis machine into his shop. He started making phone calls. He sold the ironclad one for half the price of an Omnis equivalent. But the real selling point wasn't the initial price. It was the promise. Lifetime warranty on parts. Open source schematics included in every box. The first 50 units sold in a week. The next 100 sold in a month. Word of mouth in the blue-collar trades spreads faster than wildfire. A diner owner in Chicago swapped his dead Omnis compressor for a Russo ironclad. When a fan belt snapped 3 months later, the owner didn't have to wait 4 days and pay an $800 service fee for an authorized Omnis tech. He went to a local hardware store, bought a standard belt for $12, and fixed it himself in 20 minutes. He posted about it on a restaurant owner's forum. The bleed started slowly. In the Omnis Tower, Vivian was reviewing the Q3 sector reports. The room was perfectly silent, save for the soft hum of the ventilation system. She swiped through the digital pages. Residential appliances were up 3%. Smart home integrations were up 5%. Then she hit the commercial logistics and hardware division, down 4%. Vivian stopped. She frowned, the skin between her perfectly manicured eyebrows crinkling. 4% in a single quarter was an anomaly. Omnis had held a steady, undisputed curve for 7 years. She tapped a button on her desk intercom. "Arthur, get in here." Arthur entered 2 minutes later, holding a tablet. He looked nervous. The collar of his expensive shirt seemed a little too tight. "The Q3 commercial drop," Vivian said, not looking up from her screen. "Explain it. Did we have a supply chain hiccup in the Shenzhen plant?" "No, Vivian. Supply chain is optimal," Arthur said, clearing his throat. "It's regional market erosion, specifically in the independent commercial sector, small to medium businesses, diners, laundromats, independent grocers." "Erosion to who?" Vivian snapped. "Whirlpool, GE. I thought we priced them out of the heavy-duty sector." "It's not them," Arthur said. He walked forward and placed his tablet on her desk. On the screen was a shaky, low-resolution cell phone video. It showed a man in a greasy apron standing in the back of a restaurant kitchen. He was patting a matte black ugly motor bolted to the back of a massive walk-in freezer. "Ripped out the Omnis garbage yesterday," the man in the video was saying, grinning. "Put in a Russo. Thing weighs a ton, but it purrs like a kitten. Best part? No damn computer chip to tell me I'm not allowed to touch my own freezer." Vivian stared at the screen. The name Russo echoed in her head, dragging with it a memory of stale coffee, burnt flux, and a cramped room. "Enjoy the dust, Dean." "Russo Heavy Industries," Arthur said quietly. "They incorporated 8 months ago. They've been eating our lunch in the B2B sector for independent contractors. Their sales curve is practically vertical." "Where are they manufacturing?" Vivian asked, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "You can't spool up heavy industrial casting in 8 months without a massive facility." Arthur hesitated. He looked down at his shoes. "They bought the Hawthorne plant, Vivian. The one we liquidated." Silence hung in the boardroom, heavy and suffocating. Vivian looked out the window at the city. The glass suddenly felt very thin, incapable of keeping out the messy, unpredictable reality of the world below. "They bought our toxic asset," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The irony tasted like ash. She closed her eyes, remembering the grease on her palm, the defiance in his posture. He hadn't just salvaged a broken part. He had salvaged the wreckage of her own corporate strategy. She opened her eyes, the cold, detached, CEO snapping back into place. The ulcer burned fiercely. She ignored it. "Call legal," Vivian said, her tone absolute zero. "I want every patent we hold scrutinized. I want a cease and desist drafted yesterday. Find a design infringement. Find an environmental violation at that rusted-out plant. Bury him in litigation until he chokes on it." Arthur nodded quickly and hurried out of the room. Vivian sat alone. She picked up her pen, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had mocked him for being a scavenger. Now, the scavenger was at her gates, and he had built an army out of her discarded scraps. The legal packet weighed exactly 4.2 pounds. Dean knew this because after the courier dropped it on his desk, he picked it up and placed it on the digital shipping scale used for freight calculations. He stared at the red LCD numbers. 4.2 pounds of paper meant to kill him. The break room of the Hawthorne plant smelled of burnt Folgers and wet concrete. Rain battered the corrugated tin roof. Dean tore the thick cardboard envelope open. The documents inside were pristine, printed on heavy stock paper that felt arrogant against his rough, calloused fingers. Omnis Holdings versus Russo Heavy Industries. Cease and desist. Preliminary injunction granted. Omnis wasn't suing them for the mechanical design. They were suing over a proprietary thread pattern on the primary drive shaft, a patent Omnis had bought a decade ago and never actually used. It was a technicality, a loophole, but in the federal court system, a loophole funded by $1 billion war chest was a noose. The judge had ordered a halt to all manufacturing, distribution, and sales until the trial concluded, a trial that could take 3 years. Cole walked in, taking off his hard hat. He saw the papers. He didn't ask what they were. The blood just drained from his face, leaving his weathered skin looking like old parchment. "We have $40,000 in the operating account, Dean," Cole said, his voice completely flat. "We have a loan payment of $12 grand due on the 1st. If we shut down the presses, we default in less than 60 days. Dean rubbed his hands over his face. He felt the grit of metal shavings and dried grease scratching against his cheekbones. His skull throbbed. This wasn't a movie. There was no secret wealthy benefactor waiting in the wings. There was only the brutal, suffocating math of corporate litigation. "Tell the floor to power down the presses," Dean whispered. The words tasted like ash. "Send everyone home." By noon, the Hawthorne plant was completely silent. It was a terrible sound. Without the heat of the machines and the friction of production, the damp cold of the massive building crept in immediately. Dean sat in his cramped office for hours, listening to the rain drip through a leak in the roof, hitting a rusted metal bucket with a hollow, rhythmic tink. He poured a measure of cheap whiskey into a plastic cup. It burned his throat, but it didn't touch the ice forming in his chest. 30 miles away, Vivian chewed her 4th antacid tablet of the morning. The chalky, fake peppermint paste coated her tongue. She swallowed heavily, staring at her monitor. The injunction was active. Russo Heavy Industries was legally paralyzed. Arthur had just delivered the news with a smug, satisfied smile, expecting praise. Vivian hadn't smiled back. She pressed her knuckles into her sternum. The ulcer was completely out of control now. It felt like a lit match trapped under her ribs. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office. The sky was a bruised, heavy grey. She should have felt victorious. She had neutralized a threat. She had protected the market share. The spreadsheet was secure. Instead, she felt entirely hollow. She opened her desk drawer and looked at the wet wipe she had used months ago in Dean's shop. She had kept it in a plastic baggie, a strange, morbid souvenir. The black grease stain was still there, faded but permanent. She closed the drawer violently. The wood cracked against the frame. She was Vivian Vance. No, she was Vivian Hayes. She controlled a global supply chain. She didn't care about a greasy mechanic in a dying town, but the silence in her office was deafening. There was no noise here, no friction, just filtered air and the quiet hum of servers making decisions for her. 2 weeks passed. The rust began to settle back into the bones of Hawthorne. Dean spent his days in the office of a lawyer named Miller. Miller operated out of a strip mall next to a dry cleaner. His office smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap carpet cleaner. He was disheveled, cynical, and worked on contingency because he nursed a deep, venomous hatred for corporate monopolies. "They have you by the throat, Dean," Miller said, flicking a pen against his desk. "Legally, they own that thread pattern. Morally, it's a joke. But the judge doesn't care about morals. He cares about case law." "So we just die?" Dean asked, his voice rough. He hadn't slept properly in 14 days. The bags under his eyes were the color of bruised plums. "We just let them starve us out." Miller leaned forward, his chair squeaking sharply. "You don't fight a tank with a rifle, Dean. You drop the tank in a swamp. They want a legal battle in a sterile courtroom. We need to drag this out into the street. We need leverage. Real leverage. Something that makes omnis bleed faster than you are." Dean looked at his hands. The grease was finally starting to wash out of the cuticles. It felt wrong. It felt like surrender. The leverage arrived on a Tuesday in July, not from a courtroom, but from a server farm in Shenzhen. It started as a minor anomaly, a firmware update pushed automatically to the new line of Omnis smart compressors installed in commercial supermarkets across the American Midwest. The code was supposed to optimize energy consumption during high-temperature spikes. Instead, a missing string of code in the DRM verification loop caused a fatal logic error. At 2 p.m., a massive heatwave settled over the Midwest. Ambient temperatures hit 104 degrees, and exactly at 2 p.m., 5,200 Omnis commercial compressors locked up. The digital displays flashed a single red error code, E77, unauthorized hardware detected, system halt. The machines, communicating with their internal sensors, mistakenly identified their own factory parts as counterfeit. They shut down to protect the proprietary ecosystem. In the Omnis Tower, alarms began to blare, not physical bells, but frantic, cascading notifications on every executive's tablet. Vivian burst out of her office. The floor was in chaos. Analysts were screaming into headsets. Arthur was standing by the central diagnostic monitor, his face completely bloodless. "What is happening?" Vivian demanded, her voice cutting through the panic. "The Shenzhen firmware," Arthur stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. The map of the United States was lighting up with red dots across 6 states. "It's bricking the units. The regional servers are trying to roll back the update, but the units won't accept the handshake. They're locked." "Send the technicians," Vivian snapped. "Manual overrides." "Vivian," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "There are over 5,000 units down, mostly in regional grocery chains. We have 400 techs in that sector. It requires a hard reset via a proprietary diagnostic cable. It will take them a month to reach every store." Vivian felt the blood drain from her extremities. The floor seemed to tilt. "They're grocery stores, Arthur," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "What's the ambient temperature there?" 104 degrees. Millions of dollars of meat, dairy, and frozen goods were currently sitting in steel boxes that were rapidly warming to room temperature, and Omnis had built the boxes so that nobody but an Omnis employee was legally or physically allowed to fix them. Her phone rang. It was the CEO of National Grocers, the third largest chain in the country. She didn't answer. She knew exactly what he was going to say. In Hawthorne, Dean's phone rang. It wasn't Miller. It was an unknown number from Chicago. Dean answered it, rubbing his exhausted eyes. "Is this Russo Heavy Industries?" a voice barked. The man sounded frantic, breathless. Background noise echoed loudly. The clatter of shopping carts, yelling managers, the hum of useless fluorescent lights. "Speaking," Dean said. "This is Marcus Caldwell, Regional Director of Operations for National Grocers," the man said. "I have 50 stores in my district. Every single Omnis freezer just died. They tell me it's a software glitch, and they can't get a tech out here for 9 days. I am losing $2 million of perishable inventory an hour." Dean sat up straight. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sharp, sudden adrenaline spike. "What do you need from me?" Dean asked. "I saw the trade article about your lawsuit. I know you're under an injunction," Caldwell said rapidly. "I don't give a damn. I have independent contractors standing by with wrenches. If you have those analog ironclad units in your warehouse, I will buy every single one of them at double your asking price. I will send flatbed trucks to your loading dock right now. I just need motors that don't need a Wi-Fi connection to freeze a damn chicken." Dean looked out the small window of his office onto the dark, quiet factory floor. The hydraulic presses sat like sleeping iron giants. The injunction papers sat on his desk. If he sold those units, he was in contempt of a federal court. He could go to prison. He thought about the sterile courtroom. He thought about Vivian's pristine suit, her absolute certainty that she controlled the world because she held the patents to it. "Cole," Dean roared, dropping the phone on his desk. He sprinted out of the office, his boots slamming against the metal stairs. Cole poked his head out of the break room, looking bewildered. "Hit the breakers," Dean yelled, his voice cracking with a fierce, terrifying joy. "Power up the presses. Open the loading bay doors." "Dean, the judge." "Screw the judge." Dean grabbed a heavy pair of work gloves from a workbench. "National Grocers is sending a fleet of trucks. We're breaking the seal on the warehouse. We are going to save their supply chain while Omnis chokes on its own software." 10 minutes later, the Hawthorne plant roared back to life. The deafening, beautiful thud, hiss, clank of the hydraulic presses shook the dust from the rafters. The smell of hot oil and ozone filled the air. Dean stood on the loading dock as the first massive flatbed truck backed up, the diesel engine rumbling. He was breaking the law. He was breaking the system. And for the first time in his life, he felt absolute, undeniable power. 3 days later, the deposition room smelled of stale coffee and fear. It was a neutral room in a downtown law office. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with an irritating, high-pitched whine. Vivian sat at one side of the long veneer table. She looked terrible. Her perfectly tailored suit hung slightly loose. The ulcer had kept her awake for 72 hours. Omnis stock had plummeted 18% in 2 days. National grocers had publicly announced a total severance from Omnis, threatening a massive class action lawsuit for damages and publicly praising Russo Heavy Industries for stepping in to save their Midwestern supply chain. The PR nightmare was absolute. The right to repair advocates were parading Dean like a folk hero on national television. Dean sat across from her. He was wearing his faded denim work shirt. His hands were stained with fresh grease. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were hard, relentless. Miller sat next to Dean, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. Arthur sat next to Vivian, looking like a man awaiting a firing squad. The board convened this morning, Vivian said. Her voice was brittle, stripped of all its usual corporate armor. She didn't look at Miller. She looked directly at Dean. They are dropping the patent infringement suit. The injunction is being lifted. In exchange, you will publicly state that you are satisfied with this resolution and withdraw your counterclaims regarding our DRM practices. Dean stared at her. He didn't feel the triumphant surge he thought he would. He just saw a tired woman who had engineered her own prison and locked herself inside. I'm not signing a gag order, Dean said quietly. We are offering you a full retreat, Arthur interjected, his voice pleading. You keep your factory. You get the independent market. Just let us keep the enterprise sector intact. You don't have an enterprise sector anymore, Dean said, leaning forward. He rested his calloused hands on the polished wood. National Grocers is out. 3 other chains called me yesterday. They are terrified of your software. You didn't build machines, Vivian. You built hostages, and people are tired of paying the ransom. Vivian closed her eyes. The pain in her chest was blinding. The spreadsheet was gone. The metrics were broken. I built a company that employed 40,000 people, Vivian whispered, opening her eyes. I optimized a chaotic system. You built garbage, Dean said softly, echoing his words from the cramped repair shop a year ago. You just forgot how to fix it. He stood up, pushing his chair back. It scraped loudly against the linoleum. Have your lawyers send the dismissal to Miller, Dean said. He turned and walked toward the door. What are you going to do now? Vivian asked. The question slipped out, raw and unguarded. Dean stopped in the doorway. He looked back at her. For a fraction of a second, he pitied her. She had millions in the bank, but she had absolutely nothing real to hold on to. I'm going to go back to work, Dean said. My presses need calibrating. He walked out, leaving the door open. Vivian sat in the buzzing fluorescent light. She looked down at her own hands. They were perfectly clean, smooth, and trembling uncontrollably. She was a billionaire CEO, but as she listened to the fading sound of his heavy boots on the hallway carpet, she knew the terrifying truth. She was obsolete. Do you think raw grit can beat corporate greed? If Dean's fight against the untouchable billionaires inspired you, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that the little guy can still win. And don't forget to subscribe for more intense, grounded audio dramas every week. What would you have done in Dean's shoes? Drop a comment below and let's debate.